Welcome to our panel on theatrical natures. So I'm going to first present the panelists, and then we'll discuss the production of the Aeneid you've just heard, or at least you've heard some of it, and Frédérique Ait-Touati will also talk about the resonances of this production with the work that she does with Bruno Latour, and I'm sure talk about the work with Bruno that we saw last evening. We're then going to sort of speculate on what makes it possible and what are the best practices for doing theater that's ecologically conscious. And then we'll open things up to you all. Okay? Good. So the panelists today are Una Chaudhuri, who is collegiate professor and professor of English, drama, and environmental studies at New York University. She is the director of NYU's Center for Experimental Humanities, and she is a pioneer in the field of eco-theater. Plays and performances that engage with the subjects of ecology and environment, as well as the interdisciplinary field of animal studies. Her recent publications include The Staged Lives of Animals, Zooasis and Performance, Animal Acts Performing Species Today, and the Ecocide Project, Research Theater and Climate Change. Una Chaudhuri participates in collective creative projects, including a multi-platform intervention entitled Dear Climate, which has been presented in New York, Santa Barbara, Troy, Dublin, Abu Dhabi, Houston, and the Netherlands. And she is a founding member of a theater collective, Climate Lens. Sarah Cameron Sunde is an interdisciplinary artist and director working at the intersection of performance, video, and public art. She is creator of 36.5, a durational performance with the sea, an ongoing work spanning 7 years and 6 continents. And she is the instigator of Works on Water, a new triennial dedicated to art that is made on, in, and with the water. Sunde has served as Deputy Artistic Director of New Georges for the past 16 years, co-founded the live art collective Lydian Junction and the theater company Oslo Elsewhere, and is known internationally as John Foss's American director and translator. Her work has been seen in many different venues in the US, as well as in Norway, the Netherlands, Bangladesh, Mexico, China, the UAE, Uganda, and Iraqi Kurdistan. She has received the Princess Grace Award in 2005 and in 2017, and the Creative Climate Award First Prize in 2015. And Frédérique Ait-Touati, in her writing and directing, explores the links between science, literature, and politics, and is particularly interested in the fictions of science. She has collaborated with Bruno Latour for 10 years on theatrical ways to test new hypotheses, especially on questioning the controversial new figure, Gaia, whose eruption in our lives is very difficult to respond to. Fascinated by astronomy and microscopy, she has published Fictions of the Cosmos, a study of the links between fiction and modern science. As an historian of science at the National Center for Scientific Research, she teaches at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and directs the experimental program in political arts that's in residence at the Théâtre des Amandiers in Nanterre in Paris, and she's been doing this since 2014. So these are our panelists. And I'm going to start by asking questions of Sarah and Una, and I wanted to start by what attracted you to Olivier's play on the Aeneid. What made you think that it was something that was going to speak to you in terms of interpreting it through a climate change lens?
Well, I mean, I was actually brought on to direct the play before I really conceptualized it as a way of talking about climate change. But of course, that I'm viewing everything through a climate lens now, and so that is my approach. So I think immediately, as soon as I read the text and felt moved by it, I saw the opportunity that we're talking about refugee crisis, and because there's obviously such a huge number of refugees are refugees because of climate catastrophe right now, that felt like, okay, that's the catalyst for the piece. And so that I felt like I could key into that as a way to experiment with form, and with how to bring this piece to life in a way that was exciting for me.
And so, this is a question probably for both of you. In terms of thinking about the form, because you were looking for the right form to make us feel something, right?
Yeah.
What did you do? What about the language? How did you change, or how did you work through the languages of this stage to get to this impact that you wanted?
Well, it's funny. It was great to just hear that reading, because it was reminding me of all these really specific moments in the piece and the choices that we made. And really, so Una and I were just talking about this. We have been in conversation for the last few years around climate thinking, and so we had a really important conversation as I was preparing. I had already committed to doing the piece, and I had already started working I think I'd already started working on the set design and other things, and I knew very early that I think a lot about time and time, like deep time, long-term thinking, and so I was getting somewhere in terms of trying to figure out what the image for the piece, what the metaphor of the space was going to be. That's how I usually approach it. It's kind of like, how do I tell the story with bodies in space? And then Una and I had a very informative conversation at breakfast on the Upper West Side, I remember, and we sort of talked through all the problems, the challenges with the play, and how, and we just, yeah. Do you want to take it away?
I can, yeah, just carrying on that. And kind of going back to your first question about, what interested us about connecting this with our interest in, climate things. Because we actually, given the play, and Sarah began to work on it, but this was all happening in the context of this new group that we had founded just a little bit before that. And this is a group of theater makers and educators, and it's called Climate Lens. And I've actually brought a handout for you. We're a kind of think tank, but we're also a kind of intra-artistic activist group with the agenda of really engaging our theater communities in conversation about climate. So we want to do some propaganda, hence the manifesto and the handouts and all that. So sort of shamelessly there. And one of our goals has been to really explore the possibility of, as our name says, of bringing climate as a framework of analysis and an aesthetic framework, a framework of inquiry to any and all theatrical material. Yeah. In other words, not to wait for it to be a so-called play about climate change, but to bring our interests in the subject matter to it, which means, of course, construing the subject matter very, very broadly. Yeah. And that's where, obviously, thinkers like Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway have been extraordinarily important to us. So, I think people like us who are working on climate have right now two kinds of goals. One is to expand the circle of interest or awareness, just get more people involved in thinking about this. The other, and in some ways that's more important to me, and I think to Sarah, is to shift the conversation, shift the prevailing imagination of climate change, and not just reinscribe some of its most debilitating and kind of ossified terms, right? So, like, you know, whenever I tell people that I work on theater and climate change, people will listen, they'll be a little quizzical, and then at some point, you get two questions. They used to get the question of, is it really true? Now, that's very rare, although in America, you can still, when I was traveling in Texas recently, I got that question. But the second question you get from people who, are deeply engaged but aware will say, well, are we fucked? Is it too late? Are we doomed? Are we all going to die? And so I've been very focused myself on thinking about the most helpful and creative way to answer that question. And one of the things that I've been saying is that I know we don't know the extent to which there will be, populations will be, just done away with, or death. We don't know the extent of this catastrophe. One thing we do know, however, is that there's going to be suffering, and that our brothers and sisters, our fellow citizens, both near and far, are going to be going through some very scary, unfamiliar, sudden, unexpected challenges and losses and fears and dangers. There's going to be a lot of suffering. And that's one of the opportunities, I think, for imaginative discourses, is to how to prepare us for the suffering, but not in a kind of cowering, craven way, but in some really effectively creative and robust way. And so that was one of my connections to this. So this is a play about refugees. And although there's some politics in the play which were very problematic for us. One is it's a very male vision of families, bonding, of power, heroism, of that in self-defining individual, all those kinds of things. So we had to take that on, and I think some of the choices we made with space, and we can talk about that, were ways we displaced some of that narrative. But it was also a play which had all these moments where a new kind of sociality of enforced by suffering, enforced by the suffering that you share with strangers, is marked, or is comes to the surface. So that became, for me, one of the interesting things, is that how do you tell a story about new relationships? I mean, theater is about relationships. And people don't go to the theater to get lectures on recycling or on science. They go to the theater to hear stories about each other, about human beings. So that's, I think, a bottom line. You have to stay with that. How can we make stories about human beings that are interesting, but also open to these larger questions and challenges? And I'll have more to say about that. So that was kind of my way into it. One of my ways into it.
Yeah. So how about the specific changes that you made, or choices that you made, right? The kinds of problems. We've just heard one problem that the play presented, but there are plenty of others, I think. And how did you either get around them, or how did you dive into them? How did you?
So there were sort of these two things that two big layers that I would always talk about it as, okay, so this adaptation of the Aeneid and this beautiful translation that Judy did was putting the Aeneid into the context of the refugee crisis, and then we were layering two more big ideas on that. One was that it was a climate crisis, a climate refugee crisis, and that was the instigating moment or thing that happened. And then the second was this challenging the gender, challenging the patriarchy of the piece. And so from the climate perspective, it really was, and I, you and I talk about this a lot. I actually think that it's much more powerful to layer this kind of idea into a play that doesn't necessarily have it inherently in it, because so much of it is, when you have a lot of plays that try to talk about climate change end up just feeling like medicine, and so this was like a really exciting experiment to say, okay, let's put this climate lens perspective onto this play. Yeah. How can we find all the ways in?
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
And one of the things, when you do that, you find that in fact there already is in the play. And what we found here was that, the 4 parts of the play are named after the elements. It's fire, earth, water. So already at some kind of unconscious maybe level, that was there.
Yeah.
So that I mean, to me, that's a third layer, which is just our species' life as humans is always informed by the elements.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, what the air is left out, which is kind of interesting.
Right, yeah.
But instead, what is blood,
Blood.
and then underground?
Yeah.
So under the earth, right?
Yeah.
Inside.
So it takes us inside.
Yeah. Diving down. Yeah. So anyway, the big choice was that I wanted to have as many people on stage as possible, because the images of the refugee crisis are, of course, of like, a gazillion people trapped on a small boat. And so trying to just fill the stage with bodies felt important to me. And so out of kind of thinking about in this circuitous way, I also sort of came up with this idea of having a weather chorus. So I can't remember if that came. I'm sure it came out of the conversation. But so the idea became, okay, because what do I do if I want to have as many people on stage as possible? How do I what do I do with them the rest of the time, because I want them to be involved? So in a way, it was like a very practical sort of solution to like having lots of bodies on stage. And then thinking like, okay, weather chorus, what does that mean? And so then it became about how, and my practice is very movement based, and so it came then the decision was made to really go towards a choreography, or a way that the people would just kind of constantly be present in the space and become the earth. They would become the rain and the wind. And so I had, had this idea, did not know how it was going to actually manifest itself, but knew that somehow we were going to figure it out. And then got really lucky, because there's a wonderful choreographer, Chaudhuri, who was
Chaudhuri
Kawai, who was at Abu Dhabi in that moment. And then so she was actually, and her background is in contact improv and Butoh-esque. And I do a little bit of Butoh, so that it was kind of exactly the aesthetic that I wanted, but then she was able to really work with them to create beautiful movement vocabulary for the weather chorus. And so it was really subtle, but everybody, all the people, all the performers they would like turn into the weather chorus. They would do their thing, and then they would turn into the earth or the wind or whatever. And you would see that, it's really hard in the documentation.
You couldn't see it. So there's really not, and I didn't see the show, right? So I wasn't there.
Yeah.
So the characters then didn't stay in their roles. They moved into other roles then.
Yeah.
So you created a communal body.
It was that's a good way of putting it. And so that was kind of the real, and then of course, all of the action was, we kept on talking about it dramaturgically, that the choices that the characters were making were really based on, this instigating event, and, made a decision, but everybody sort of had different ideas about what that could be, whether it was flooding or the crops have died, and why exactly they had to leave. But the point was that they had to leave, and it was because of a climate catastrophe. So dramaturgically, the choices were all geared towards that. And then the big thing was the weather chorus. I would also say, go ahead.
No, we're just going to start talking about the baby.
Oh yeah, the baby. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, in terms of yet another kind of major shift from the text we got, which was of course in the original, it's a son, And there's a lot of talk about, you know, I have to save my son, and sons and fathers and brothers, and there's very much that kind of lineage, patriarchal lineage. So, you know, first we thought about having that be a daughter, but then we just kind of wanted it to be more of a kind of a sense of futurity, and we
it came out of, it came, again, it sort of came out of a practical thing. I hate seeing babies on stage, like fake babies. It drives me insane when there's a fake baby on stage. And so I was like, what are we going to do about this baby problem? Like, they're supposed to be carrying the kid the whole time. And so it was really, and I knew that I wanted, that we were, because sound and music was a big part of the piece as well. I brought over a collaborator, and we worked with, we had like it was actually underscored almost the whole thing, and there was an undertone that was layered in with climate data. It was sort of algorithmic climate data underneath the entire piece, and then there was also like a composed score as well. And I wanted one live instrument on stage. At first I wanted many, but then Josh talked me down to just one. And I was like, okay, there's one instrument on stage. And so then when I was like putting together these problems of, you know, baby, what do we do with a baby? And one instrument, I was like, oh, okay, the instrument is the baby. And the baby can be represented by a violin because the violin is kind of the right shape, and that's a great instrument to have on stage that can kind of go over all this electronic sound score. And so it just kind of, it was one of those things that just kind of came together out of many conversations.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it doubles back on that desire to displace the patriarchal, you know, main narrative, because it's a kind of non-reproductive futurity. It's an aesthetic futurity. It's a you know, some kind of human cultural creation that's represented by music.
The music, yeah, of course.
Yeah. And then, you know, just because they had the violin, they had to treat it, you know, in this very loving way.
It was actually the violin case. So, like, what we did was we had at the very beginning, the violin player, who was actually the performer, she came out and she took the violin out of the case, and then she sat on her own little spot of land, which was then used at the very end. Nothing else happened there except for the very beginning and the very end. And that was the sort of tiny piece, and there was a little orange tree. And that was so that represented the past and the future. And then the violin player, so in a way, then represented the baby. So every time she would play, it was, and we, you know, did it so that it was in relationship to the cries and stuff, but also very musical, not pretending to be a cry. And so you had this, the presence of the future was always on there. Stage. Yeah. Which I was really, I was like, oh, we should do this again. It's a really good, we did a good job.
Well, it was just partly this, the thing, we have one of our platforms on this is about, you know, flatten your ontologies, but also unflatten your geographies. What happens here doesn't stay here. The far away folds right onto the here and now. So it's partly about disrupting that sort of teleological thing, which also underwrites a progressive, you know, fantasy of individual striving and so forth. And the set was quite dark and daunting, because I mean it was talking about such a difficult experience, but we also wanted to have sort of over and against it a very simple rendering of the terrestrial, you know, of just the simplicity of a bit of soil with something growing there, without a big song and dance.
And how did you do that?
That was the space where...
That was the space where
the violin and there was an orange tree there. It was there throughout.
Yeah.
And that came out of the problematic of this idea of quest for land in the piece, because...
we want to displace that.
Yeah, feeling like that was not necessarily the way that we should be looking at conquering empires or taking over new spaces is not what we want to advocate for. And so how do we you know, I remember said this thing of like, you know, what do we need? We just need like what do you need to survive? Just like one little pepper tree or orange tree or something.
That would be me.
Yeah, you wanted the pepper tree.
I just need a pepper.
and so having this idea of having one live thing on stage and just making it a small little thing, and we sort of massaged the text to help it be less about conquering from a very
but I mean
perspective.
it's already quite changed, because all of the end of Virgil's Aeneid is a
Sure.
battle after battle after battle, and
Oh,
all that's gone in
totally.
Olivier's text.
Totally. And then we just like went even further towards the feminine, I would say, or I don't know. Like,
Yeah, right.
Some sensitivity there.
Yeah.
But I mean, so all the choices were sort of just geared around this big idea of vastness and climate and the relationship between the human and the non-human. And then the other big thing was this question of gender, and that was mainly dealt with in the choices of the casting and especially the choice with the daughter and the mother. Achates also being sort of a main driver that gets Aeneas through this journey. And so basically Aeneas was the only one who was really left as a male character. And that really came down, actually I considered having a woman play Aeneas as well, but in terms of the casting, it worked out that there was a guy who could do it, and it actually felt like the strongest choice in that moment to have all of the other characters be the women and have him still kind of getting through the journey, but trying to make it very clear that he only gets through it because of all of the help from all these other characters.
Yeah. That's very strong in the play anyhow. I think. That's a very good aspect of the play.
Yeah.
And so the ending, I mean, in all of this perspective, endings are very important. Those of us who do theater, we know that the play has to end somehow, right? And
unfortunately.
Olivier imagines a happy ending, basically, because there they arrive at the new land, and he's with his baby, and he's got his new woman. Okay. Yeah. So I'm just wondering if you messed with the ending or not. The music, obviously, that's already starting to say something different, right?
Yeah, and I think we tried to leave it as a questionable happy ending, much more ambiguous. At the very end, the final image was actually of all the people standing behind, stuck in this. They were like, after they crossed through the barbed wire and they got to this other place, I left it ambiguous as to whether he stays with the woman or not. And so we're in this new place, but then the final image was of all of them, the refugees.
Just standing behind the button, not getting
through.
It was partly, again, to get back to that, the interest in the new socialities that are emerging, new identities that are based on, need for a different kind of friendliness or kinship, based on having to be with strangers in extremely trying circumstances.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't want to end something like that on a falsely cheerful note.
No.
And but on the other hand, we were trying to, I think, not buy into the default position of catastrophe and apocalypse, which is very debilitating around this topic.
Yeah.
And it's what people think they're going to get when they hear that a play is about climate. They fear that they're going to go there and be guilt-tripped and made to feel horrible and made to feel depressed and so on. And I mean, those things can't be dismissed. Those affects are very much part of this condition. But one of our, within Climate Lens, one of our inquiries is how we can expand the stylistic register and the range of affects that can inform our dealings with the non-human and with our life as a species. And I thought that was one of the things that worked really well, because the play has these lovely comic scenes.
Yes. Yeah.
And it also has some cynical scenes, like the one with the
immigration officer.
Immigration officer. Yeah. So there are many. I mean, it's a very richly, it's by no means a one-note take on this topic. And so I think Sarah's production really brought that up to the surface. And so there were some very funny things. But then the other thing was that the music was also, it was just beautiful, but it was also quite eclectic. And there was also an incredible sort of dance in the middle that one of the students
we had
did.
A break dance.
A break dance and a kind of disco. And so, what you were also getting was a sense of, there's a kind of energy with these with a lot of those were young people, and that's always going to be there, and that can connect to new definitions of resilience, which can be more enjoyable than just scary.
Yeah, the breakdance really came out of the graffiti. That's in the text. It's a graffiti artist.
Yeah, it's the kind of interesting meta-theatrical kind of thing where you have the person who can see, and also the person who's demonstrating what's already happening. And, but giving it a form that's not necessarily a verbal form, which I think is also important.
Yeah,
and it seems to me a lot of what we talked about yesterday was finding ways of saying without words. Right.
Yeah. That's where theater comes in.
Yeah. So, Frédérique, so you heard this, and you saw a bit, and you heard what Sarah and Una have just said. Does it resonate with the kind of work that you do and the kind of work that you've been doing with Bruno?
It does a lot indeed. First, I wanted to say how wonderful I found the reading this morning, and how it touches upon one very specific point, which I understood only recently, and I found this intuition in your play amazing. The intuition is basically, we don't have land anymore. We are all refugees, and we will soon be. And I found that your production, as much as I can grasp with the beautiful reading and images, I think that's exactly the point, and that's such a powerful intuition, and it resonates, of course, because one of the phrases, sentences this morning was, I think, we have no land, and I think it does resonate not only with the kind of work we've been doing with Bruno Latour, but with the kind of situation we are in, all of us now. So what does that mean to take this big epic, story of exile, and to turn it into something completely contemporary? I think that's a very, very powerful gesture. So I was very happy, and also extremely happy to hear more about your own path towards climate and theatre, and in many ways I wanted to say how inspiring your work has been. And I just can say a few words of our own way of doing that, because it's striking. I really have the feeling that we had somehow a parallel path on the other side of the ocean. And when I read now your climate lens, activist tract and everything, I feel extremely close to that. So just a few words how we started working on that with Bruno. It was around 2008, so really 10 years ago, and he said, look, I think we should do something about climate with theatre. At that time, Bruno didn't do any theatre. He knew I was doing some, so he thought we should do that. So we started our own little group, much smaller than yours, but the same idea. Let's put together, thinkers, playwrights, philosophers, Bruno Latour's daughter, Chloé, who is another director, myself as a director, and we started to think, what can we do about that? So the first thing was a kind of a little manifesto, a bit like yours, but again, just the beginning in 2009, a little article that we wrote, Bruno and I, saying, okay, Gaia is entering the stage of the world. What do we do with that? And it was a very open dialogue where we tried to think, okay, what is the relationship between science and theater? How can we do something which is not scientific plays? We know it's a genre. It's not a genre that we found relevant. So we started to discuss all the problems we could see in front of us without knowing at all how to solve them. And then what we did in the further years was to try, if I try to summarize the kind of 4 or 5 projects we've been doing together on theater and climate, we tried different thought experiments, I would say, different ways, different forms, different formats, different scales to tackle the problem. And now that I look back, and it's still going on because there's a next project after Insight, but when I look back at the few projects we had, I can see that our relationship to Gaia evolved a lot through theater. And of course, at the same time, Bruno was writing Facing Gaia and then Down to Earth. So it was a kind of parallel path of the thinking and the theater. And this is what I found really interesting, that the theater doesn't come afterwards as a way to, disseminate ideas that have been formed in a laboratory or in a mind, but it actually follows the thinking. So what we first did with our little research group was to take Chloé's company and my own theater company, 2 actors each, and we went for 3 years following Bruno Latour on his fieldwork on Gaia, so meeting climatologists, scientific researchers, but also philosophers, historians of science, and that ended up by being a play called Gaia Global Circus. That was at the Kitchen. In New
I
York.
saw it. It was fabulous. Yeah.
Some time ago, and the play itself was, in a way, our first attempt to tackle things, and I think it had so many defaults. I can see them now. Like it was climate as a theme instead of climate lens, but we hadn't reached that point yet of seeing climate as our condition, the new climatic regime, so to speak, the new terrestrial condition, if I could use that. So before that, we would see climate as a theme, and people said, "What, you're doing a play about climate? What a strange theme for a play. What an unappealing, not sexy theme at all." And I remember the work for me was mostly to know where to put science on stage, whether science had to be really developed as a visual or put on the side. And actually, I completely join you on that feeling. Our main thing with Gaia Global Circus was to think, okay, we don't have the affects, we don't have the feelings, the emotions yet to cope with that.
Yeah, I must say that I have to stop. I thought I loved Gaia's Global Circus. I thought it was actually had broken away from some of those heavy, ossified forms of climate theater. Partly because it was also very funny. It was very self-reflexive.
Tragic comedy was the name we used.
Yeah. Yes. And so, I mean, it was already refreshing to bring in these other affective registers, just to humor.
Because climate plays already existed for you.
Yes.
For us, it was completely new.
I see. Yes.
So you saw that with your gaze of knowing already
I'd seen a few climate plays,
okay.
Right, yeah.
So that we didn't know, that's the French delay.
I don't know.
We have lots of
we're very far behind, believe me.
But it's interesting that you say that it's indeed the question of having some humor in the play was absolutely central.
Yeah.
And that's also one of the links with your work. I can see that the idea of what can theater do about that. Theater can't create blockbusters. Theater, we don't have money for that. We don't have, it's not our aesthetics. So what do? We have bodies. That's why I was so interested in what you said about, what can we do with our theatrical language. Bodies, we have feelings, emotions. and we have space, basically.
Yeah.
So I do.
No, go on.
The space interests me quite a lot, because when you were here last year, Frédérique, we saw another manifestation of work towards climate, but it wasn't exactly theater, but it was theatrical in certain ways. And I was thinking about that last night, sitting in the Italianate theater space that we were in, and thinking to myself, is this the best space that we can use to do this kind of theater work? Are there better spaces for us? And this has a lot to do, obviously, with how we position the audience. So last night we received Bruno Latour speaking to us, but we weren't necessarily in it. In your show, and what we could see of it, the audience is quite close, right? So, and the actors are moving in, and this is just a question about, I think we probably need all kinds of forms of theater, right? But I'm wondering about how you're thinking about this.
I think that's one of the main questions. That's why we try different things, and my feeling that we fail each time and we try another one. That's how I see things. So the first Gaia Godot Circus was a typical play with feelings, I think, that happened really, and I'm glad you. And the second theatrical attempt was a performance in all the spaces of a theater, the Théâtre des Amandiers, which was the theater of negotiation, Make It Work. 200 students that we invited from all over the world to enact the COP21. It was 6 months before the Paris Agreement, and it was so heavy to do.
It's brilliant, and it's brilliantly described and discussed in Chapter 8 of Facing Gaia.
Yes,
I've been teaching it.
And that's another link between books and theatre, and to see how actually a theatrical experiment doesn't come after the book, but actually informs it. I like. And this was also a space experiment. How do you take not only one room in a theater, but actually the offices, the corridors, the garden, the entrance, and how do you make it into an experimental space? And the result, so to speak, of this yet another thought experiment and spatial experiment was that I think it completely failed for the spectators, and I think it was absolutely amazing, life-changing for the participants. So it was some kind of a theater for the people. And I think the film also helps to grasp that, because there has been a film which is free on the internet called Climate by David Bronstein. So, but you can grasp things. But people were, I think, very disappointed when they tried to enter a very technical, political, diplomatic kind of discussion, scientific discussion in Nanterre. It was hard. But really, all the students who were there, and the artists and the architect, they were completely transformed by the experience. So that was another strong thing. And the theater itself was changed. The whole Théâtre des Amandiers has changed its ways of entering.
And it stayed that way.
And it stayed that way. And now it's getting renovated in the coming years. And it will keep lots of things that they made for the theater of negotiation. So that's also very interesting to see how climate modifies, in a way, theatrical space.
Can I say something about space? Please, since just going off what you said, that in some ways there's no more land, and we're all refugees. That made me think about this really interesting point that Latour was making yesterday about, he said something like, it's not that this is a new world. When he's talking about the terrestrial, I imagine most of you were there for the performance last night. So the terrestrial is not a new world in the sense of the old new world where you found another continent, but it's a new world within this world. And so I would say that it's not quite that there's no more land, it's that we have to completely change our relationship to land. And like what you all were saying about now, instead of thinking about regions and nations and ecologies, think about this this layer, which the critical zone, that's another kind of lens that you're offering. And I thought two things there. One, I thought it was very interesting how he was struggling for words, to even name this new world. And we didn't really get a definition of critical zone except quite briefly. But that's actually a theme in contemporary climate philosophy, including in Latour's work, but especially in Donna Haraway's and Amitav Ghosh, which is the unthinkability, the sort of cognitive impasse, the difficulty of getting our heads around some of what's happening. Not just what he said about thinking of ourselves as geological forces, which is, we used to think of ourselves as political or biological at the most, but not geological, and that's a hard thought. But to me, that whole challenge, which is a philosophical challenge, is just a challenge of thinking, it's two things. It's where the philosophers become such important partners. And I mean, I don't think I could have written this, or we could have, come to this working group and created these principles without Haraway, Latour, and these folks, and then making commitment to how to translate that into our language, which is theater. And as you said, Frédérique, that's bodies in space and stories. And so to me, it's almost like I'm almost regretting that we call it climate lens now, and I feel like we should call it, I don't know, species lens or Earth lens, or, as you call it, Gaia. But climate is so associated with catastrophe and difficult change and climate change that's ultimately not the thing that's going to that defines the critical zone and the terrestrial. What defines it is weather and soil and getting more and more interested in those things and more aware that they're happening to us all the time.
And it seems to me that's the big challenge for all of us, and it seemed to me to be some of the challenge that was being articulated yesterday, which is we have categories that we think in, we have language that we use, none of it is adequate to sort of address the situation that we're in right now. So how do we get through those barriers? How do we do, in theater, for example, maybe should we get rid of actors? Is it?
Oh no, they're
well. I mean,
humans.
Or do we put something else on stage as the vector, right, as the conveyor of life?
See, for me, looking for changes, to change the structure and so on. We might fall into that progressivist narrative, where we've thought about going from realism, from symbolism to naturalism to realism, or whatever it is. We know all our.
We just take pills,
and
then we live somewhere else.
Yeah.
We go to Hades together.
So to me, it's like how to just go to the theater we have. Okay, Donna Haraway's great book, recent book, is called "Staying with the Trouble." That's where we are. It's the theater we have. It's the climate we have. It's the humans we have. And it's there that this lens of the critical zone or the non-human has been brought, and everything in that, like everything in the theater, whether it's an Italian theater or a theater in the round, it's made of stuff. It's made of matter. Humans have their biologies, and so that's all there already. It's just a matter of how to get interested in it at this layer, the layer of critical zone, rather than, because we spent a lot of time in the history of eco-theater looking to change let's not do it inside, let's go to the park, let's go to the lake. In fact, for a while, that became a big problem, because the minute you said, I'm going to do eco-theater, they thought, oh, shit, we have to go out. We hoped it was good weather that day. And, it was a necessary stage, but that was the stage where we're still thinking about the non-human as being out there instead of everywhere and here and as our substrate and context.
I could relate to that very much, saying that we also started with the idea of climate in the first play, and now the question is not climate anymore, as you said. It has shifted.
Its place.
And it's also really phases of understanding. And I like the fact that theatre is a way to clarify things, to get deeper into our thinking. Again, it's a heuristic way. So the question of, okay, theatre is a closed world inside. You know, I play a lot with that, of course, in the staging of Inside. It's cut. It's artificial. It's the most possible artificial space. So it's apparently you could say, okay, let's go outside. And we had this idea of doing the Gaia Global Circus outside, but of course I had this crazy helium vellum that was flying. So if you put that outside, you fly immediately. So it was a very bad
goes
idea.
against his recommendations.
Not to mention the insurance that you need for that.
So basically going outside was a bad idea, and we discarded it. So it's interesting that you can test so many things with our theatrical space, and you can test the multiplicity of species that Emanuele Coccia discussed yesterday, the fact that even in our houses, even in our most artificial human spaces, it's actually completely mixed. Sure. So we don't need to go outside. And in this little article that we wrote with Bruno in 2009, we make the parallel between laboratory and theater. And of course, you can see that you can play with this inside, outside, testing, experimenting in a closed space. What happens outside?
It does always has seemed to me that theater is a completely free space, but it doesn't always feel that way to us. But it is completely free when the work is really wonderful. And therefore, the space itself doesn't matter anymore, the real actual physical space, because we're in this other space, right? We're in the space of imagination, and we're all there together. So we're in a place where we can feel things we've never felt before. But how we manage to make that happen is complicated.
I want to say one more. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No,
go.
it's
No,
okay.
no, go on.
No, finish
I'll
your
come
thought.
back. No, I'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say that, I think that challenge of like when you're working indoors, it is this question of what is the world we're creating, because we're creating a whole other world in this space. So that's interesting. I also think that my version of theater doesn't necessarily need to be indoors. I think it's also, it's like, how can you create something good if you're, it's hard to layer a challenge, like what do we do about this? And it's all about thinking, and I'm thinking specifically for myself. Like I was working mostly indoors, but then also sometimes site specifically. But then the thing that the piece that really got me going and thinking about climate was actually breaking out of my normal form. And that was all about ideas. And that came out of Hurricane Sandy happening and really like recognizing that, oh, New York might be underwater. Before I die, we might have to abandon the city, and feeling that in my gut, and then just like searching in the world for how do I articulate this image that I have in my head. And that ended up being an outdoor performance that happened. And so I'm just thinking about how it's really about continuing to think about the ideas and letting the ideas manifest however they need to manifest themselves. And maybe that, and putting that, I guess that's what I'm thinking, is putting that first.
Yeah,
you know?
I want to tell you what she's talking about, because I'm the biggest fan of this piece that she's alluding to. It's called 36.5, and this is the piece that is going on over a number of years in different continents and different oceans. And Sarah goes and stands at the edge of the ocean at low tide with her ankle deep, and then stands there until the tide comes in up to her chin, and then stays there until the tide goes out. So she stands there for about 13 hours. Yeah,
and
it's
I invite the
extraordinary.
public to stand up.
Yeah, I was getting there.
Okay.
I'm doing a special issue of a journal on this piece with different perspectives, because it's a very simple piece. It's almost like like a Beckett place, like Happy Days or something, and yet it's because of that. There's so much. But one of the things that you get there is a different account of theater and spectatorship, because she seems to be the protagonist standing there, but she's just looking out. And then others come and stand with her. They always stand behind you, and they can come and go, or do whatever they want on the beach. Some of them make dances and songs, or whatever. But it is exactly, it's creating this incredible, expansive arena for continuing to think about those things. And for me, because I've been working on this, it's been so influential precisely in this thing about thinking about theater spaces, and theater structures, and how you construe spectators and so on. And I mean, I think that what you said, Frédérique, that it is, that the gift of climate to us now is the gift of experimentation. We have got to really put the theater and its capacities at the service of this question. But and that's one way, that some of the science theater has been really regressive, because what they've done is put themselves at the service of science, rather than put theater, into the conversation. You get a lot of collaborators, collaborations, which wind up sort of, telling the story for the scientists.
Yeah. And I think it's about, really quickly, I think it's about the reconsidering the elements of the earth. So like the water becomes the protagonist actually in my piece, and so it is a collaboration with the water. And I think the attempt of the weather chorus in the Aeneid was how do we collaborate with the elements in an indoor space? I mean, successful or not, like that was in a way the idea, even if the bodies in space are representing the elements. Like how do you get towards that? And reconsider our relationship to the environment, the space around us, the non-human.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the things that's the most compelling and interesting, and in the inside-outside piece as well. It's this sense of being permeable, constantly permeable, and permeable to the images that came last night, so that one isn't just, and that was the idea, right? One's not looking, but one's being penetrated by. One is part of those. And so boundaries kind of dissolve. Yeah. But it is very hard to realize that. And in an imaginative space, of course not, but with sound, one can do it. With light, one can do it. But bodies next to bodies, it makes it a little harder unless you group bodies together. But there are lots of ways that one might think about experimenting with this.
Or you put us in touch with the fact that our bodies are porous already, that we're constantly interacting with the outside. And ways to, highlight that.
It's interesting because, again, the different plays, productions, all try that, exactly what you're saying. How do we feel that we are on the same boat, to take again the metaphor of your play? How to include the audience in different ways? I mean, this is an old traditional question of theatre. How how do you break the fourth wall and all that? But of course, the question of climate change is again this porosity. But just to go back to the question of science and theatre, what's very moving with all those little attempts we've made is that unlike science, theatre, as you said, Yuna, it's not putting theatre at the service of a finished science. It's more like, okay, for instance, this idea of critical zone, Bruno took it from geologists, but they don't really know what to do with that. It's a kind of recent, field in itself. Earth system science, it's all, how do you study the very thin crust layer? And again, the hesitation and vocabulary is interesting. How do you study that? By mixing up all the geology, biology, but also what kind of image do you have for those things? And that's where art comes in, and that's why the work that you showed yesterday in Inside, made by Alexandra Arène, Axel Grégoire, Sonia Levy, it's all important to have little groups that unite people, because we try together to find new images. And it's very moving for me to know that what we made for Inside was then used in a Nature article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, this little new cosmology. It's made by an architect who is also an artist, and then it's taken by Jérôme Gaillardet, who is a scientist, and he says, "Oh yes, that's what I want to say." So it's not, you know, it's really going together, art and science things.
Which used to, I mean, that was the
What
way.
it was,
Yeah,
in
I
the
mean,
17th century.
yeah,
That's why
even
it's moving
as
to
late
see
as the
that
19th.
it happens again on those questions. How do you represent to yourself? That's the whole question of Inside. How do you represent the Earth differently? And we don't, of course, we didn't manage in a way. We didn't give the new image, but we try with sound, with images, with drawing, with architecture, with design. We try to approach it.
And I think what I loved was that you were modeling that process of searching and the enjoyment and excitement of, you know, asking those questions. I think that's really the most important message to be getting across now, which is like, let's all join in asking these questions, you know, and that depending on, it can be on with using any of your skills. Anyone with their skills can join this conversation.
Yes.
You don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be an artist. Everyone has some skills.
Well, that's a good segue.
Bring the audience in.
Yeah, bring the audience in. Would anyone like to ask a question?
Hi, I just wanted to, was going to comment on this question of theater as opposed to the purpose of theater, as opposed to the to explore the art as opposed to just present the science. It can be, I think it can be both, but it's necessary for theater to be an escape. If you're presenting science, then you're just representing reality, and that's not the purpose of theater. Theater is more like to escape your reality, right? A little bit.
I don't think anybody here would say that.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. Not reality, but your condition. Like we find ourselves in a predicament, and you need some escape from that to take a look at it from outside.
Can do
We
that.
have movies for that. We have movies for that. Cinema.
So I was thinking more in terms of like maybe science fiction would be appropriate for theater in that sense, because there is a lot of science that's being done that is not being put into effect because there is no money. Nobody. There is a question of who's going to pick up the bill. Like there's several. I attended a conference recently, and there's like several ways to inject carbon dioxide into rock, and the rock completely absorbs it, and carbon dioxide becomes rock. But this is very costly, so nobody is willing to pick up the cost for this. There is also talk about they have like a small white silicone chips, sort of like snow. You can put all over the Arctic. That would reflect the sun, so it keep the Arctics the cool.
Cooler, yeah.
And this is also very costly. So there's just prospects, but nobody knows about it, and nobody wants to pick up the bill. So this is where the theater can present these things as a science fiction, as a possible future world where these kinds of things exist. Obviously, they don't. So it still presents the imaginative, but it's theater. I thought this is it acceptable to
I mean,
dramatist?
Sure. I mean, I think you're talking about all fiction, not just theater. It could be film, it could be novels. They can all serve in that way, and in Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, one of the things he talks about is science fiction and the historical sort of discounting or derogation of science fiction in favor of realism. And he explains, you know, the sort of underlying ideology that made us take science fiction less seriously. And Donna Haraway talks about speculative fabulation. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of people, artists now, engaged in that project of science fiction, speculative fiction, and so on, theater and beyond. Yeah.
And there's quite a lot of commentary now about why there's such an apocalyptic vision in television, on television series, right? Why the zombies, why the various Frankensteinian figures, and partially it would appear that it is to figure the apocalypse and make us more used to the fact that something awful is coming. Well, wouldn't it be better to figure some potential solutions? Yes, I agree with you.
I must give a shout out to there's a book, I've been mentioning a few books, but there's one book that I think everyone who cares about the art and climate should know, and that's called Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. And we have one of the editors here. But it is a book of essays, and I couldn't recommend it more. And even just from the title, you can see the intervention it's making, Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, not dying. And I think that's the orientation that's interesting, exciting now. Yeah. And now we hear from the editor.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk with it. Thank you so much, Una. That's very kind. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the temporality of theater. So it seems to me the difference between doing a film or cinema versus doing a theater is that you're sharing the same now with the audience. What's the significance of that, I guess? So basically, if you could think a little bit about contemporaneity and what theater does.
Well, that was one aspect of the very first play we did with Bruno Latour, the Gaia Global Circus. The idea was that the discussion with the audience afterwards was actually part of the production in a typical activist play, you know. And we started with puzzlement, with can you say that? Being puzzled?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first. We wanted to share with an audience during a certain time this mix of feelings. And of course, there's also this old, very typical theatrical idea that you are in a common political space while you share that. So I think it's, yes, in a way, the idea of a political experiment would work, and the same with the Theatre of Negotiation Make It Work project. It was 1 week, but for 1 week we share a space and we try to change completely how we think of the political entities that can actually participate in the diplomacy. And so in each case, I would say, whether it's 1 hour play or a 1 week performance, there is this idea of you build your audience. It's a very American idea, also pragmatist idea from Dewey. You build your audience and you share with this audience what you have to say. So the discussions before, after have been always part of this activist trend of our endeavors.
I think, I mean, time, being in space with other people in real time is all about, it's all about experience. It's having an experience. And so, and, you know, I think about this a lot, actually, because my work is sort of on the, I work in performance, and now I'm also working in video, and so I'm sort of constantly actually trying to translate the live experience into a live 3-dimensional experience into a 2-dimensional experience. And I had a project last night, which I couldn't come to the Brunner lecture last night, but I was just talking with my friend about it, because I was like, there's no way to document this in a way that will actually share with an audience or someone who's watching it on the screen what it was to be in that space. There's no way to do it. You can't, I try so hard, and you just can't do it. And I try, with 36.5, I filmed the entire thing in real time. I try to like share the experience of being in that space with people who aren't able to be there. But they don't, there's no substitute for being, you know, in this space with these people at this present moment. And so that's critical in terms of how we, you know, it's like how things are sparked. Well, I think.
For the actors or the audience?
For both.
For both.
Yeah. Because an emotion. It's about it's about that feeling, the sense of who are we? Why are we here?
I mean, I think one thing you could hear from all our answers is time is a very weird thing in theater. It quickly collapses into space. It's very hard for us to talk about here now without talking about here. I mean, I have lots more I could say about this, but we'll just move on.
Maybe just a follow-up if I can. For Frédérique, though, it seems really interesting because you're talking about individuation, right? So is the theater a space in which you kind of instantiate processes of becoming, right? Where individuals sort of become something else. I mean, that's, maybe I'm reading between the lines, but it seems that you're talking about creating a political space, a space where individuals can become something else that might be somewhere in between an individual and a collective for a temporary moment.
Well, thank you for this phrasing, because I never thought of it like that, and I think it's very illuminating. I'm not sure we managed to do that, but in a way it might be one of the aims. You're very right. Just let me give you a very simple example. This performance of 1 week with students, the Theatre of Negotiation in Nanterre, each of them had to be a representative, like in big international gatherings, and they had to choose to be the representative maybe of a state, but more interestingly and more strangely, they could choose to be representative of, you know, animals, or not a state but an endangered territory. And of course the whole idea,
Ocean,
which has ocean and forests and soil, oil in the ground, was a very interesting group. And of course that idea of extending political representation to non-humans has been very much criticized, including by people in the room. You know, can you actually extend political representation? It was an attempt again, and can you have humans taking the lead and talk for? You know, that's a very old, both political and theatrical question. So we addressed it. So yes, in a way, what you said, that for the duration of the performance, you have an individual who becomes something else, a collective, a group of entities, a group of living beings who have interests, questions, sufferings. You know, yes, theater allows that, and we know it since the Greek. You know, you can have the dead speak, you can have the forest move and speak on stage. Theater has no problem with that. So what if we take this old power of theater and we bring it into our current political situation? That's one way to do things.
I'm just curious about whether you're thinking about staging a play about climate, making the play directly or indirectly about climate change, how that thinking might have been shaped by its performance in an oil-rich city in a desert.
Yeah.
Oh, climate change is everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about that so much, actually. I think because the adaptation is so beautifully open in terms of location, we weren't placing it in a specific land mass on the planet. We were really it was really sort of the every person, every place. It could be anywhere. And later, the Ankaisi speech sort of names all of the possible kind of refugees, and those were it was amazing because 10 years ago when it was written, some of those are even more resonant today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would have been an interesting thing to explore, but not only that it was an oil-rich country, but that it was being staged by Americans who have established an institution there, and Americans are maybe not as oil-rich, but certainly more oil-consumptive. So they, Abu Dhabi can very easily become a scapegoat for a phenomenon that is much, frankly, the other places that are much more responsible for climate, for the current climate crisis than, yeah. No, I know. Yeah, but I mean, so it's very easy for us to go into that, for it to become about oil and about oil as it is producing wealth now. So you'd have to go into a whole history of, of how this place becomes so rich at this point. So, I mean, I just think that it's a very complicated thing to. Yeah. I mean, that's what I mean too. Yeah.
There is that scene in the play that I haven't quite figured out, although that we've talked about in my graduate class, and that is when Beroe starts tearing the plants from the earth, and what she covers her face with, and what everyone covers their faces with, is dark and oily, and the Pirgo says it's blood. But I thought afterwards, the last time I read it, maybe it's not blood. No, maybe it's oil. And maybe there is something being said then, at that point. And then the text goes on to say, the earth moans. There are voices coming from the earth moaning.
Is that in Oliver's?
It's in Olivier's text.
Yeah, so it could be tar sands, not just oil.
Yeah, it could be all kinds of
Since
things.
he's Canadian.
Yeah.
Coming back to the relationships between theater and science, my question is about the status of science on stage. Yesterday, at the very beginning, Bruno Latour said, well, we are in a theater, but well, for me, that's still a lecture. So we know that's, well, in a way, thanks to the climate changes, science became a popular topic. And especially in theater, I think, for example, to Jean-François Perret, it's been 15 years that he collaborates with the scientists like Alain Prochians or Françoise Balibar about Einstein. Anyway, and so would you say that through theater, science is a fiction becomes a fiction, or is, for example, yesterday was it a show or a new kind of pedagogy for science on stage? Because of course we know, and that's very interesting to understand, that science uses imagination, and well, that's what's the interest of all those schemes made by artists, and we know that's, well, there are so many paradigms and imagination in science itself. So would you say that the content is still very important, and that's, well, so science becomes more understandable thanks to the stage, or would you say that science becomes a fiction?
Well, thank you very much for your question, because you really tackle one of my central own personal question, both in my research and in theatre. The first answer is no, it doesn't make it a fiction at all. I'm very interested in the role of fiction in certain contexts, but I think it's very interesting that we had this New York Times article yesterday about post-truth philosopher Latour, and actually how the journalists managed to completely reverse this false idea and show that it's actually about that. I found that very clever gesture. And indeed, what we're talking about is not at all fiction, and the point is not to make it fictional because it goes on stage, is to use, I would say, the haptic powers of stage, the fact that stage allows us to feel other things better. But where your question really is very important to me is that the question is, what kind of genres do we create with those questions? And I really have the feeling that our common question here and our climatic problem situation forces us to go beyond some genres. So of course, this lecture performance, I decided to call it like that because it goes into a well-known category somehow. So it's reassuring for producers, theaters. But normally when you say conférence performance, it's more an artist that goes towards knowledge and that plays with it, usually, undermines it often or makes something different with knowledge. And in that case, I thought, okay, let's do the contrary. I have Bruno as a material. I'm quite lucky. And the idea was not to make him into an actor. And that's why the only direction I give him is, Bruno, tonight you make a conference. You don't play. You don't act. Because I think he acts enough already as a philosopher. You don't need to add up anything. So that's why this idea of having a scream is actually exactly what I make of the production. You have different layers. You have the lecture, you have the philosopher, and you put him inside his own PowerPoint. Yeah. And the result is a mixture, is a layer, is a layering. But it doesn't mean that he goes somewhere else. What it makes as a result, you say it. I'm not sure, but to me, it's just that there is an interesting route of experimenting with genres there, and especially the idea of performing knowledge, or what is the position of science on stage. And I would say that in each of those forms that I have experimented with Bruno, the philosopher and the knowledge and the science was not exactly at the same position. In Gaia Global Circus, he gave us the momentum, the idea, but he didn't write the play. The play was by Pierre Daubigny, and he didn't do the staging, but he was giving us the impulse, and he was doing his field work with us, actors and directors. In Theatre of Negotiation, he gave the whole idea of, okay, let's make a thought experiment. What if natural entities could be in the COP21? So he was more like a dramaturge. And then we take, inside, I take him as a philosopher as he is already, and I try to share. And I don't know if that works, but the whole idea of inside was that we are somehow in his mind. So the idea is that it doesn't supposed to help us. It's not a vulgarisation. It's not, and I'm quite happy when he gets difficult on stage. I'm quite happy when he really makes a real philosophical conference. It's not simplified science. It's not fictional science or philosophy. It's not, it's just pure philosophy, kind of pure Latour, but in a different space and setting. That's the challenge.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, but then Because then there's an outing to the Earth Room. So.
Good morning. Thank you for this very excellent discussion. I was thinking about yesterday about insights, and what I wanted to say is that what I appreciated, what I liked yesterday during this moment is that I never felt inside. Not 1 second. I totally felt outside. Because, you know, most of the time in my day, I don't spend my time in a dark room, you know, with someone behind a veil, with outstanding images projected on a screen. I was totally outside, and it was great. It was a great feeling, in fact, to be in this very exceptional moment in which it's possible to rethink my relation with space, time, thought, philosophy, actors, what does it mean to speak and to give a lecture. So I learned a lot thanks to this exteriorization of my body during an exceptional moment. In a way, yesterday, the second thing I would like to say is that we were in a cave. We were in Plato's cave, and we can understand that for Plato, the cave is the outside. And so when he escapes, when he gets out, he finds the possibility of a proximity with the good. And this moment of proximity is for the philosopher the only moment during which it's possible to find a kind of insideness. But in fact, he feels compelled to abandon this enjoyment, this jouissance, and he needs to come back in the outside, that is to say, where we are, like now, in this room. Because in fact, real life, politics, ethics, lectures, and performances occur outside, in a certain kind of confrontation and differences with the people to whom it's possible to speak. And of course, the problem is that when this poor philosopher, a little bit too much narcissistic, decides to free some people and to tell, hey, you know what, we are outside. And what happens when this poor, crazy philosopher decides to speak to people and to free them and to speak about the outside, at this moment, he is killed by people saying, not at all, we are inside. Don't forget that we are all inside. Don't forget that there is no outside. Please stop thinking, dreaming about an alternative. There is no alternative.
Well, I just want to say something about the inside.
Yeah.
I have an article that I wrote called The Fifth Wall, in which I talk about breaking the fourth, that, you know, we're all so familiar with the fourth wall, and we've spent the 20th century breaking the fourth wall. And the fifth wall, I posit, is the one that all nations share, the border that all nations share, which is the border with the atmosphere. And that maybe now it's that wall, the fifth wall, that we have to start paying attention to. And so, you know, in my article, I actually talk about looking up, not in order to get outside, but in order to get beyond the definition of the inside that has prevailed in drama and theater history, which is the inside has been entirely associated with the social, the sociological. And to look up is to actually let in, I would say, science, or, you know, not just the atmosphere, but all those non-human systems, ecological systems that have been systematically backgrounded or ignored by the sort of exclusive social focus of theater, even the theater that broke the fourth wall. It broke it to be political, but not to be biological or geological. So there is another kind of outside, and this kind of it goes back to your question, which is the outside which wants to take science very seriously, and include it, but also include it in a theatrical vein, which is also to play with it, you know, to mess with it, to activate it in a variety of ways that scientists themselves can't do. But I mean, our second thing there is occupy science, befriend facts and factoids, enrich theater with the bristly nomenclatures of the natural sciences. And it's about how this could make the stories we tell about ourselves so much more interesting if we included more of the information that's that's out there from those fields, from the sciences. So that's the inside-outside that I've been more interested in, get out of the social or the sociological and into the ecospheric. I call it ecospheric.
Yeah. I mean, the cosmic, in certain ways, has also always been on stage in certain forms of drama.
Yes, but exactly, it's the sociological and then the cosmological. Yeah. You know, it's the humans and then the gods. Yeah. But you know, the non-human world, the animals and plants and winds and oceans, not so much.
Can I just say the last word? Thanks a lot for your reading of the play yesterday. And you're absolutely right in saying that we are in Plato's cave. It was actually the command by Philippe Ken, who invited us 2 years ago at the Théâtre des Amandiers to be part of a big thing called Welcome to Caveland. So he invited us, and I told Bruno, look, I think we have to do something in this Caveland thing. And the first version of Inside said, oh, welcome in the cave. Yesterday he said, welcome to Inside, because the Caveland command is already passed and we're not in the Philippe Ken setting anymore. But you're absolutely right, we are in Plato's. And the second thing I wanted to say about the cosmic and what you said yesterday, that the play we are producing now, we are working on now, is a parallelism between Galileo and Lovelock. So it's completely on that question, how do we relate to cosmology now? And it was already a little bit in there yesterday, but it's the next project. So yeah, thank you.